Sona is a farmer and has large acres of land where she rears chickens and grows corn, beans, and yams. Every day, Sona sees growth in different forms on her farm. She plants beans and corn seeds, and they grow into plants that yield fruit. Her chicks also grow into chickens. Now, every month, Sona expects to get an average of 10 bags of beans, 25 bags of corn, and about 45 chickens, and about 30 crates of eggs as output from her farm. Now, every year, her total output increases. This is called economic growth. So, just like a farm, our economy also grows. But how do we observe the growth within our economy? On one hand, an economy is said to have grown if there is sustained increase in the actual output of goods and services per head over time. In the first year of business, Sona Farms only supplied their products to 2 states, but now they deliver to 14 states across the country. Sona has gone from supplying grains to processing the corn and beans into powders and cereals in her factory, which she supplies across the country. She has had to employ more staff because the workload had increased and she pays them monthly salaries. Her staff then spend the money on better housing, better education for their kids, and better healthcare facilities for their family in Central Africa, which helps develop the economy. Economic development, on the other hand, means more than mere growth. It is the process of growing the economy to improve the quality of life for everyone in the population.
Today, let's take a look at 2 different economic systems, market economies and planned economies.
It all comes down to who owns and controls the factors of production. These are the major inputs required to produce stuff, and Karl Marx classified them as land, labor, and capital. He even wrote a book about it, Das Kapital. In a planned economy, the government controls the factors of production, and it's easy to assume that's the same thing as communism or socialism, but that's not quite right. According to Karl Marx, the theory of communism may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. So true communism is a classless society. When I say classless, I'm talking about a social order where everyone owns the factors of production and output is distributed equally. Kind of like China and Cuba and the former Soviet Union, except not at all. In practice, no country has ever truly been communist, but there's a lot of countries that are socialist. Often socialism has both private property and some public ownership and control of industry. The goal is to meet specific collective objectives and to provide free and equal access to things like education and healthcare. In both communism and socialism, there is economic planning, and the government, usually in the form of some bureaucratic agency, helps decide what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets it. Now, if an economy is completely controlled by the government, down to the number of shoes that should be produced, that's called a command economy.
On the other side of the spectrum, we have free market economies. In free market or capitalist economies, individuals own the factors of production, and the government keeps its nose out of the stuff and adopts a laissez-faire or hands-off approach to production, commerce, and trade. We often take markets for granted, but look at the alternative. Assume instead that a government agency was in charge of deciding exactly which types of cars and cell phones and shoes to make. Do you think they could quickly respond to changes in tastes and preferences? If there was only one government monopoly producing cars, do you think they'd be produced efficiently?
So the invisible hand of the free market is the idea that individuals and businesses meet society's needs when they seek their own self-interest. Competitive markets with profit-seeking businesses will have an incentive to produce high-quality products as efficiently as possible. In the words of Adam Smith, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Now, it looks like the free market's perfect and we don't even need a government, but that's not quite right. Right? There's a bunch of things the government must do because free markets won't.
In a free market economy like the United States, you might think that the government doesn't tell car producers what types of cars to produce and how to produce them, except that it does. Cars need to meet strict emissions and safety standards, and there are laws dictating how much manufacturers can pollute and how workers should be treated. And here's the big takeaway. Modern economies are neither completely free market nor planned. There's a spectrum of government involvement. For example, on one end we have North Korea. They have a command economy where production is entirely controlled by the government. On the other end, we have countries like New Zealand. They have private property, few taxes, and few regulations. In the middle, we have the rest of the world. So most modern economies are actually mixed economies with both free markets and government intervention.
And a great way to explain a mixed economy is by looking at something called the circular flow model. Let's go to the thought bubble. A modern economy is made up of households, which are individuals like you and me, and businesses. Businesses sell goods and services to households in the product market. That's anywhere goods and services are bought and sold. The households need to pay for those goods and services, but where do they get the money? The households earn the money by selling the resources like labor to businesses. Now, this is done in the resource market. The businesses use the money they earn from selling products in the product market to pay for resources in the resource market. And households use the money they earned in the resource market to buy products in the product market. But there's another key player in the economy, the government. The government also buys products and resources. For example, they'll buy cars from businesses and hire government employees like policemen to drive them. The government pays for public goods like roads and bridges and public services like firefighters and teachers. They also provide transfer payments to individuals in poverty and subsidies to businesses to produce things like fuel-efficient cars. But where does the government get the money? Well, you get some of it from taxing households and businesses, and you get some of it from borrowing. But we'll talk about that later. So basically that's it. That's the circular flow of products, resources, and money, and the interactions between businesses, individuals, and the government. Now, it gets more complex when you add in international trade and the financial sector, but for now, the simplified circular flow shows how the modern economy works.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. We've established that economies differ based on the amount of government involvement, but it's important to keep in mind that economies can change. Over time, Denmark and Canada have adopted more elements of a planned economy, like universal health care. China, on the other hand, has added more free market elements to its economy, and now has less government ownership and control of production. So communist China actually has a socialist market economy. But which type of economy is better? And how much should the government get involved?
So let's wrap this thing up. In practice, almost all countries are somewhere between the extremes of a command economy and a completely free market economy. That's because mixed economies seem best at handling the circular flow of goods, money, and resources. But the debate over free markets and government control will never end.
Well, actually, it will end when humanity ends, because microscopic organisms don't divide themselves into factions based on economic theory. But anyway, that's why it's vital for you to be informed about the merits and the limitations of economic systems and be willing to support solutions that get the job done as opposed to getting stuck in one ideology. Economic theories and models can seem really great in the abstract, but when they're kicked out into the real world and actually have to govern the affairs of billions of people, it turns out that some flexibility is a very important thing.
Good day, everyone. We are Group 3, and today we will be discussing the classic theories of economic growth and development. This topic is central to understanding the factors that drive economic growth and development, and is of particular importance for policymakers and economists. Economic growth and development are crucial for improving the standard of living for individuals and communities, and the classic theories aim to provide insights into how this can be achieved. So, for the brief introduction, every nation strives for development. Economic progress is an essential component, but it is not the only component. Development is not purely an economic phenomenon. In an ultimate sense, it must encompass more than the material and financial side of people's lives to expand human freedoms. Development should therefore be perceived as a multidimensional process involving the reorganization and reorientation of entire economic and social systems. In addition to improvements in income and output, it typically involves radical changes in institutional, social, and administrative structures, as well as in popular attitudes and even customs and beliefs. Finally, although development is usually defined in a national context, its more widespread realization may necessitate modification of the international, economic, and social systems. Let's start by examining the 4 approaches to the classic theories of economic development. These approaches aim to explain the factors that drive economic growth and development. The classic post-World War II literature on economic development has been dominated by 4 major and sometimes competing strands of thought. First, we have the linear stages of growth model. 2. Theories and patterns of structural change. And 3. The international dependence revolution. And 4. The neoclassical free market counter-revolution or institutional theory. So first, we have the linear stages of growth. The first approach is the linear stages theory, which views development as a series of stages that countries must go through to reach advanced levels of economic growth. This theory argues that countries will experience similar patterns of development and that there is a set path they must follow. So, one of the best examples of this model is the Rostow's stages of growth. This theory argues that economies pass through 5 stages of growth, from traditional society to the age of high mass consumption. So, as we go Further, on this presentation, there will be a deep discussion regarding this theory. Next is we have the theories and patterns of structural change. This is focused on theories and patterns of structural change. Using modern economic theory and statistical analysis in an attempt to portray the internal process of structural change that a typical developing country must undergo if it is to succeed in generating and sustaining rapid economic growth. One of the prominent examples of structural change is the Lewis theory of economic development. This theory argues that economic growth and development are driven by shifts in the structure of the economy, particularly the movement of labor from agriculture to industry. Next, we have the International Dependence Revolution. The International Dependence Revolution was more radical and more political. It viewed underdeveloped in terms of international and domestic power relationships, institutional and structural economic rigidities, and the resulting proliferation of dual economies and dual societies both within and among the nations of the world. Dependence theories tended to emphasize external and internal institutional and political constraints on economic development. This revolution changed the prevailing linear stages theory of development and the emphasis on internal factors as the key drivers of growth and development. Instead, it focused on the role of international factors such as trade, investment, and the transfer of technology in shaping the economic growth and development of countries. And next, we have the neoclassical free market counter-revolution. This emphasizes the beneficial role of free markets, open economies, and the privatization of inefficient public enterprises. Failure to develop according to this theory was not due to exploitative external and internal forces as expounded by dependence theorists. Rather, it was primarily the result of too much government intervention and regulation of the economy. This emphasizes the role of political, legal, and social institutions in promoting development. This theory suggests that a country's political, legal, and social institutions play a crucial role in shaping the economic environment and determining the path of development. Moving on to the linear stages theory, this approach views development as growth and believes that countries must go through a series of stages to reach advanced levels of economic growth. Two prominent examples of this approach are Rostow's stages of growth and the Harold Domar growth model. So, in Rostow's stages of growth, the most influential and outspoken advocate of these stages of the growth model of development was the American economic historian Walt W. Rostow. According to Rostow, the transition from underdevelopment to development can be described in terms of a series of steps or stages through which all countries must proceed. He creates 5 stages that countries must go through to reach advanced levels of economic growth. So, here we have 5 stages of economic growth. Traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity, and age of high mass consumption according to Rostow. These stages are linear and must be completed in sequence, with no skipping or reversal. In the traditional society stage, the economy is characterized by subsistence agriculture and low levels of economic activity. In the preconditions for the takeoff stage, the economic experiences an increase in the level of investment and a shift towards more modern economic activities. The takeoff stage is characterized by rapid economic growth and increased levels of investment. In the drive to maturity stage, the economy continues to grow and becomes more technologically advanced. And lastly, the final stage, the age of high mass consumption, is characterized by a high level of economic activity and widespread prosperity. Next is we have the Harrod-Domar growth model. This focuses on the relationship between saving and investment and the role that capital formation plays in promoting economic growth. According to the Harrod-Domar model, investment and saving are two sides of a coin and must be balanced in order for economic growth to occur. The model argues that investment must be equal to saving and in order to sustain economic growth, and that countries must have a high level of savings in order to achieve a high level of investment. According to the Harrod-Domar model, a country's rate of economic growth is given by the following equations. And here's the equation. Growth rate is equals to savings rate over capital output ratio. So, what is capital output ratio? The capital output ratio is a measure of the productivity of capital and represents the amount of capital needed to produce one unit of output. The savings rate represents the fraction of national income that is saved and invested in the economy. The model suggests that if a country wants to achieve a higher rate of economic growth, it must either increase its savings or improve the productivity of capital. Overall, the Harrod-Domar model provides a simple but powerful framework for understanding the relationship between savings, investment, and economic growth. Now, let's turn to the structural change models, which emphasizes the role of shifts in the structure of the economy in promoting development. Here we have the structural change models. Structural change models are a group of economic theories that focus on the transformation of the economic, industrial, and institutional structure of an economy over time. These models argues that the process of economic growth and development is not just about the accumulation of capital, but also involves a series of changes in the economic structure of a country. Um, this structural change involves virtually all economic functions, including the transformation of production process, changes in the composition of consumer demand, international trade and patterns, and resource use, as well as changes in socio-economic factors such as urbanization and the growth and distribution of a country's population. One prominent example of this approach is the Lewis theory of economic development. Here, we have the Lewis theory of economic development. The Lewis theory of economic development, or also known as the two-sector model, was developed by economist W. Arthur Lewis in the 1950s. The theory argues that the process of economic growth and development in underdeveloped economies is driven by the movement of labor from agricultural sector to industrial sector. According to the Lewis theory, the key to economic development is the transfer of labor from traditional sector to the modern sector. This transfer is driven by a rise in the wages in the modern sector, which attracts workers from the traditional sector. As the modern sector expands, it creates a demand for goods and services, which in turn stimulates economic growth and development. The Lewis theory also stresses the importance of surplus labor in the traditional sector, which is the pool of unemployment and underemployment workers who are available to be absorbed into the modern sector as it expands. The theory argues that the availability of surplus labor is what makes it possible for the modern sector to grow and create economic development. In summary, the Lewis theory of economic development is a seminal contribution to the field of development economics, providing a framework for understanding the role of the modern sector in the transfer of labor in economic growth and development. Next, we have the structural change and the patterns of development. This is an attempt to identify characteristic features of the internal process of structural transformation that a typical developing economy undergoes as it generates and sustains modern economic growth and development. The best known model of structural change, based largely on the empirical work of Hollis B. Chenery and his colleagues, is known as the dual sector or two group model of development. Dual sector or two gap model. According to this model, in low income countries, the majority of the labor force is employed in the agricultural sector, which is characterized by low productivity and low wages. In order, in order to achieve economic growth and development, the economy must transition to a modern industrial sector, which is characterized by a higher productivity and higher wages. So, the dual sector model argues that the main constraints to this transition are two gaps: the savings gap and the foreign exchange gap. The savings gap refers to the lack of domestic savings that are necessary to finance investment in the modern industrial sector. And on the other hand, the foreign exchange gap refers to the shortage of foreign currency that is required to purchase the necessary capital goods and technology needed to develop the modern industrial sector. Chenery and his colleagues used this model to explain the experiences of a number of countries, and it includes India, and to develop policy recommendations aimed at promoting economic growth and development.
Okay, so now let's proceed to the international dependence revolution. So the theory of international dependence went out of favor to a large degree during the 1980s and the 1990s. Versions of it have enjoyed a resurgence in the 21st century, and some of its views have been adopted, albeit in modified form by theorists and leaders of the anti-globalization movement. But before it went out a large degree, it first gained increasing support, especially in developing country intellectuals, as a result of growing disenchantment with both the stages and structural change models. Essentially, international dependence model view developing countries as beset by institutional, political, and economic rigidities, both economic and international, and caught up in a dependence and dominance relationships with rich countries. Dependence here is the reliance of developing countries on developed country economic policies to stimulate their own economic growth. Dependence can also mean that the developing countries adopt developed country education systems, technology, economic and political systems, attitudes, consumption patterns, dress, and so on. Dominance, however, in international affairs is a situation in which the developed countries have much greater power than the less developed countries in decisions affecting important international economic issues, such as the prices of agricultural commodities and raw materials in world markets. Within this general approach are three major streams of thought. So, the three major streams of thought of international dependence models are the neo-colonial dependence model, the false paradigm model, and the dualistic development thesis. So, let's proceed to digging deeper on these major streams of thought. The first major stream, which we call the neo-colonial dependence model, is an indirect outgrowth of Marxist thinking. It attributes the existence and continuance of underdevelopment or the economic situation characterized by persistent low levels of living in conjunction with absolute poverty, low income per capita, low rates of economic growth, low consumption levels, poor health services, high death rates, high birth rates, dependence on foreign economies, and limited freedom to choose among activities that satisfy human wants, primarily to the historical evolution of a highly unequal international capitalist system of rich country, poor country relationships. Is it that rich nations are intentionally exploitative or unintentionally neglectful, that the coexistence of rich and poor nations in an international system dominated by such unequal power relationships between the center or the developed countries and the periphery or the developing countries renders attempts by poor nations to be self-reliant and independent difficult and sometimes even possible. The elite's activities and viewpoints often serve to inhibit or to prevent any genuine reform efforts that might benefit the wider population. Imagine that. The elite's activities and viewpoints often serve to inhibit or to prevent any genuine reform efforts that might benefit the wider population, and in some cases actually lead to even lower levels of living and to the perpetuation or continuation of underdevelopment. In short, the neo-Marxist neo-colonial view of underdevelopment attributes a large part of the developing world's continuing poverty to the existence and policies of the industrial capitalist countries of the Northern Hemisphere and their extensions in the form of small but powerful elite in the less developed countries. Revolutionary struggles, or at least major restructuring of the world capitalist system, is therefore required to free dependent developing nations from the direct and indirect economic control of their developed world and domestic oppressors, which is basically this international dependence revolution. To sum up, neo-colonial development as one of the major streams of thought in international dependence model is a model whose main proposition is that underdevelopment exists in developing countries because of continuing exploitative economic, political, and cultural policies of former colonial rulers toward less developed countries. A second and less radical international dependence approach to development, which we might call the false paradigm model, attributes underdevelopment to faulty and inappropriate advice provided by well-meaning but often uninformed, biased, and ethnocentric international experts advisors from developed country assistance agencies and multinational donor organizations. These experts are said to offer complex but ultimately misleading models of development that often lead to inappropriate or incorrect policies. Leading university intellectuals, trade unionists, high-level government economists, and other civil servants all get their training in developed country institutions where they are unwittingly served an unhealthy dose of alien concepts and elegant but inapplicable theoretical models. Having little or no really useful knowledge to enable them to come to grips in an effective way with real development problems. They often tend to become unknowing or reluctant apologists for the existing system of elitist policies and institutional structures. So, this false paradigm model is the proposition that developing countries have failed to develop because their development strategies have been based on an incorrect model of development, one that, for example, overstresses capital accumulation or market liberalization without giving due consideration to needed social and institutional change. Third is the dualistic development thesis. Implicit in structural change theories and explicit in international dependence theories is the notion of a world of dual societies of rich nations and poor nations, pockets of wealth within broad areas of poverty. Dualism is the existence and persistence of substantial and even increasing divergences between rich and poor nations and rich and poor peoples on various levels. When we say dualism, it is the coexistence of two situations or phenomena, one desirable and the other not, that are mutually exclusive to different groups of society. For example, extreme poverty and affluence, modern and traditional economic sectors, growth and stagnation, and higher education among a few amid large-scale illiteracy. Specifically, although research continues, the traditional concept of dualism embraces four key arguments. Letter A, different sets of conditions of which some are superior and others inferior can coexist in a given space. Example of this element of dualism include the dependence notion of the coexistence of powerful and wealthy industrialized nations with weak, impoverished, peasant societies in the international economy. Letter B. Coexistence is chronic and not merely transitional, meaning it is not due to a temporary phenomenon, in which case time could eliminate the discrepancy between superior and inferior elements. In other words, the international coexistence of wealth and poverty is not simply a historical phenomenon that will be rectified in time. Letter C. Not only do the degrees of superiority or inferiority fail to show any signs of diminishing, but they even have an inherent tendency to increase. So, for example, the productivity gap between workers in developed countries and their counterparts in most developing countries seems to widen. And letter D, the interrelations between the superior and inferior elements are such that the existence of the superior elements does little or nothing to pull up the inferior element, let alone trickle down to it. In fact, it may actually serve to push it down to a develop develop its underdevelopment. E. The neoclassical counter-revolution, market fundamentalism. The 1980s resurgence of neoclassical free market orientation toward development problems and policies counterpart to the interventionist dependence revolution of the 1970s. In the neoclassical counter-revolution, market fundamentalism consists of two major streams of thought, namely challenging the statist model, free markets, public choice, and market-friendly approaches, and the traditional neoclassical growth theory. Number one, challenging the statist model, free markets, choice, and market-friendly approaches. In the 1980s, the political ascendancy of conservative governments in the United States, Canada, Britain, and West Germany came with neoclassical counter-revolution in economic theory and policy. In developed nations, this counter-revolution favored supply-side macroeconomic policies, rational expectations, theories, and the privatization of public corporations. In developing countries, it is called for free markets and the dismantling of public ownership, status planning, and government regulation of economic activities. The central argument here is that underdevelopment results from poor resource allocation due to incorrect pricing policies and too much state intervention by overly active developing nation governments. The neoliberals argue that by permitting competitive free markets to flourish, privatizing state owned enterprises, promoting free trade and export expansion, welcoming investors from developed countries, and eliminating the plethora of government regulations and price distortions in factor, product, and financial markets. Both economic efficiency and economic growth will be stimulated. Contrary to the claims of the dependence theorists, the neoclassical counter-revolutions argue that the developing world is underdeveloped not because of the predatory activities of the developed world and the international agencies that it controls, but rather because of the heavy hand of the state and the corruption, inefficiency, and lack of economic incentives that permeate the economies of developing nations. What is needed, therefore, is simply a matter of promoting free market and laissez-faire economics within the context of permissive governments that allow the magic of the marketplace and the invisible hand of market prices to guide resource allocation and stimulate economic development. The neoclassical counter-revolution can be divided into three component approaches: the free market approach, the public choice or new political economy approach, and the market friendly approach. Free market analysis is one of the component approaches of the neoclassical counter-revolution argues that markets alone are efficient. This free market analysis is a theoretical analysis of the properties of an economic system operating with free markets, often under the assumption that an unregulated market performs better than one with government regulation. Again, that unregulated market performs better than one with government regulation. Under these circumstances, any government intervention in the economy is by definition distortionary and counterproductive. The second component is the public choice approach, which argues that government can do nothing right. This is because public choice theory assumes that politicians, bureaucrats, citizens, and states act solely from a self-interested perspective, using their power and the authority of government for their own selfish ends. But what did they do? They used political influence to obtain special benefits from government policies that restrict access to important resources. Politicians use government resources to consolidate and maintain positions of power and authority. Bureaucrats and public officials use their positions to extract bribes from rent seeking citizens and to operate protected businesses on the side. Finally, states use their power to confiscate private property from individuals. The net result is not only a misallocation of resources, but also a general reduction in individual freedoms. The conclusion, therefore, is that minimal government is the best government. Simple, the public choice theory. The new political economy approach is a theory that self-interest guides all individual behavior and that governments are inefficient and corrupt because people use government to pursue their own agendas. Okay, so the third and last component of neoclassical counter-revolution is market-friendly approach, which recognizes that there are many imperfections in developing country product and factor markets and that governments do have a key role to play in facilitating the operation of markets through non-selective or market-friendly interventions, for example, by investing in physical and social infrastructure, healthcare facilities, and educational institutions, and by providing a sustainable or a suitable climate for private enterprise. This market-friendly approach is the notion historically promulgated by the World Bank that successful development policy requires governments to create an environment in which markets can operate efficiently and to intervene only selectively in the economy in areas where the market is inefficient. The second streams of thought of neoclassical counter-revolution is the traditional neoclassical theory. Another cornerstone of the neoclassical free market argument is the assertion that liberalization of national markets draws additional domestic and foreign investment and thus increases the rate of capital accumulation. Solow neoclassical growth model, for which Robert Solow of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology received the Nobel Prize, is probably the best known model of economic growth. It implies that economies will conditionally converge to the same level of income if they have the same rates. More formally, the standard exposition of the Solow neoclassical growth model uses an aggregate production function where, as we can see, Y is gross domestic product. K is the stock of capital, which may include human capital as well as physical capital. L here is labor and A represents the productivity of labor, which grows at an exogenous rate. To sum it up, the solo neoclassical growth model in which there are diminishing returns to each factor of production but constant returns to scale. Exogenous technological change generates long-term economic growth. According to traditional neoclassical growth theory, output growth results from one or more of three factors. A. Increases in labor quantity and quality through population growth and education. B. Increases in capital through saving and investment. And C. Improvements in technology. Classic theories of development, reconciling the differences. In this chapter, we have reviewed a range of competing theories and approaches to the study of economic development. And each approach has its strengths and weaknesses. The fact that there exists such controversy, be it ideological, theoretical, or empirical, is what makes the study of economic development both challenging and exciting. Even more than other fields of economics, Development economics has no universally accepted doctrine or paradigm. Instead, we have a continually evolving pattern of insights and understandings, reflecting in part improved data and emergence of new technologies and new institutions that together provide the basis for examining the possibilities of contemporary development of the diverse nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We do suggest that something of significance can be gleaned from each of the four approaches that we have described. We have a continually evolving pattern of insights and understandings, reflecting in part improved data and emergence of new technologies and new institutions that together provide the basis for examining the possibilities of contemporary development of the diverse nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Although a good deal of conventional neoclassical economic theory needs to be modified to fit the unique social, institutional, and structural circumstances of developing nations, there is no doubt that promoting efficient production and distribution through a proper functioning price system is an integral part of any successful development process. And that's it. We are at the end of the chapter. In summary, each of the approaches to understanding development has something to offer. Their respective contributions will become clear when we explore in detail both the origins of and possible solutions to a wide range of problems such as poverty, um, population growth, unemployment, rural development, international trade, and the environment as well. They also inform contemporary models of development and underdevelopment to which we turn in the next chapter. And in that, thank you for listening, and we hope that you understand our lesson and happy learning.